that woke Sergeant Mara Voss from a dead sleep was not the proximity alarm. It was the sound the ocean made when something very large moved through it. She had grown up on the coast of what used to be called the Baltic Sea in a fishing village that smelled of brine and diesel and the particular loneliness of people who make their living from water. Father had taught her to read the ocean the way others read faces. By the way it leaned away from a thing, the way it pulled back before something came up from underneath. She had not heard that sound since childhood. She had never expected to hear it again in her life, and certainly not from the observation deck of a deep orbit monitoring station on the far side of the Corvith system. She heard it anyway, not literally. The observation deck didn't pipe in exterior audio. In the 16 months since the Veth had been mapping what lay beneath the ammonia seas of Corvath 7, the station's seismic readers had been producing a signature that every analyst on the team had agreed looked at a certain visual scale, and with a certain deliberate squinting, almost exactly like a deep water pressure wave. Something very old turning over in its sleep. Nobody had squinted hard enough until tonight. Voss pulled up the seismic log at 0214 station time and sat with it for 11 minutes before she called Dr. Okubo. "I know what time it is," she said when he answered. "I know you know," he said. "So this is real. Come look at it." He came, he looked. He sat down in the chair beside her and did not say anything for a long while. The readout scrolled. The ammonia sea 300 kilometers below them was doing something it had not done in any of the 17 years of recorded data from Corvath 7. It was pulling back from the western continental shelf in a slow, massive withdrawal, like a held breath. "That's a displacement event," Okubo said. "Yes, something caused that displacement." "Yes," he reached past her and pulled the seismic archive back 14 months. Signature, smaller, quieter, barely a whisper in the noise. Then 12 months, then 8, then 6. Each instance slightly larger than the last, each one spaced a little closer to the next. "It's been waking up," he said. Voss had already called the commander by then. She was pulling on her boots with her free hand when she heard his voice go very flat and very careful in the way voices do when the thing being described is too large to fully process. "How big?" he said. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the displacement readings, the pressure wave signatures, the 17 years of data they had on the Corvath 7 subsurface, and how none of it had ever suggested anything like a living mass of this scale was possible. She thought about what her father used to say about the sea, that it kept its biggest secrets for last. "Don't know," she said. "I've never seen numbers like these before." He was quiet. "Commander, get the team up," he said. "All of them. Right now." The Veth had come to Corvath 7 for the same reason they went everywhere. Because something there was worth taking. In this case, it was the deep-sea mineral deposits, a particular class of crystalline compound that occurred naturally in only 3 known locations in the explored galaxy, and that the Veth had been extracting from the other 2 for the better part of a century. Human science had figured out the compound's existence roughly 40 years ago. Human industry had figured out what it was worth roughly 35 years ago. Veth had figured out that humans would eventually try to claim Corvath 7 roughly 28 years ago, and had moved first. The Interstellar Resource Treaty of 2189 was a masterwork of deliberate vagueness. It specified, in 1,200 pages of language that had required 4 years and 11 separate translation committees to produce, almost nothing with certainty. What it did specify, in the one sentence that every human negotiator had privately agreed was the only sentence that mattered, was that the Veth had primary extraction rights to any mineral deposit on a world that their survey vessels had catalogued first. They had catalogued Corvath 7 in 2161. Human explorers had arrived in 2163, 28 months. The monitoring station had gone up under a human-Veth joint operations agreement that had taken another 4 years to negotiate, and that required, as its central clause, that any findings of scientific significance on Corvath 7 be shared equally between both parties. The Veth had agreed to this clause because their xenobiological teams had spent 3 years studying the planet's subsurface and found nothing alive down there. Nothing. Not a bacterium, not a spore. Nothing that metabolized, reproduced, or moved with any recognizable intentionality. They had been 17 years wrong. The Veth science liaison's name was something that human vocal anatomy could not reproduce. So the station crew called him Bracket. He had a face like a deep-sea fish. Wide-set eyes positioned for detecting movement in near-total darkness. A jaw that opened further than jaws had any business opening. Skin that changed color with his internal temperature in a way that made him easy to read once you knew the palette. He was a deeply intelligent being, and he was, in Voss's experience, genuinely committed to the collaborative mission of the station. He was also very clearly terrified. She watched the color drain from his skin in the station's small conference room as Okubo walked through the data. Chromatophores under his epidermis cycled from the warm amber that was his baseline to a cool, washed-out silver that she had only seen once before. When a coolant line had ruptured near his quarters, and he had believed, for about 40 seconds, that the station was catastrophically depressurizing. "This data is verified," Brackett said. It was not a question. 3 independent sensor arrays, Okubo said, referenced with the satellite seismics. Yes. Brackett was quiet for a moment. The translator pendant at his throat pulsed green as it processed, then amber as he spoke. "There is a term in our language for what your readings describe. It does not translate precisely. Closest approximation is the thing beneath all things, which was old before memory." Voss watched him. "My people have a record of a creature of this description," Brackett continued. "It exists in our oldest texts, xenobiological texts, not mythology. I want to be clear about this. Recorded observations from a survey vessel crew, 17,000 of your years ago, who encountered something of this scale in the deep ocean of a world in what you call the Helix Nebula. They described it as," he paused, the translator pulsed. "They described it as the loneliness of deep time made physical." The room was quiet. "Their survey vessel was destroyed," Brackett said. "The creature did not pursue them deliberately. It simply moved, and they were in the way." Commander Reyes, who had not spoken since sitting down, said, "How deep is the western shelf?" 14 kilometers at the shelf break, Voss said. "Seismic origin point is at 22. And how far is that from the Veth extraction infrastructure?" Nobody answered right away, because they all already knew the answer, and none of them wanted to be the one to say it. 11 kilometers, Brackett said quietly. The extraction infrastructure on Corvus 7's western shelf was 47 years old and represented, by Voss's back-of-the-envelope calculation, something in the range of 900 billion credits of investment, 17 automated drilling platforms, 4 processing stations, a deep transit pipeline that stretched 200 kilometers east to the upwelling zone where Veth mineral freighters took on their loads. It was the single most valuable piece of industrial infrastructure in this sector of the galaxy. It was also, from the perspective of something 22 kilometers below it that had been asleep for 10,000 years and had just begun to stir, essentially invisible. The readings at 0600 showed the creature ascending, not fast, not urgently, but the slow, immense pace of something that has all the time in the world and has never had a reason to hurry. 0900, it was at 18 kilometers. By noon 16. Brackett spent the morning in communication with the Veth Directorate. Voss spent it in a careful review of every piece of data they had accumulated on the creature over the previous 16 months, looking for something, a behavioral pattern, a feeding response, a territorial marker, anything she could hand Reyes and say, "Here, this is the lever. This is how you move it." She found one thing, and she wasn't sure whether it was a lever or a prayer. Displacement events, all 14 of them, over 16 months, showed a directionality. They were not random. Creature moved in a long, slow arc, always curving westward, always returning to the same general zone of the subsurface, the same deep valley, 22 kilometers down, that the Veth seismic surveys had catalogued in 2161 and classified as geologically unremarkable. The creature always came back there, every single time. "It's not migrating," she told Okubo. "It's circling something, waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" She pulled up the geological survey, looked at the valley, looked at the formations on its eastern wall, the particular structure of the rock, the way the strata ran. "I think," she said slowly, that there used to be more than one of them. Okubo sat with that for a while. The bones, he said. The geological record shows a significant mass extinction event in the Corvus 7 deep ocean, approximately 14,000 years ago. Volcanic activity, whatever lived down there mostly didn't survive it. But something did. One thing. One thing. And it's been circling the same valley for, we don't know how long. Maybe the whole 14,000 years. Maybe longer. He was quiet for a moment. He stopped. Yeah, she said. At 1340, the creature surfaced for the first time. Surfaced was perhaps the wrong word. It did not break the ammonia sea. It rose to within 3 kilometers of the surface, and the displacement of water was sufficient to generate waves 60 meters high that rolled outward from the point of origin in every direction. And that, when they reached the eastern shore of the western continent 4 hours later, would strip the automated processing station there down to its foundation bolts. The station's deep imaging array caught the first visual. It was not complete. The ammonia atmosphere of Corvus 7 did not permit clean optical imaging at depth, but it was enough. Enough to see the scale of the thing. Enough to understand, in a way that data alone had not conveyed, what 14,000 years of solitude in the dark looked like when it finally decided to move. It saw the image and made a sound that the translator did not attempt to render. Reyes looked at Voss. Voss looked at the image. Okay, Reyes said. Talk to me. What do we do? She had been building the answer to that question since 6 in the morning, and even now she wasn't certain it was an answer so much as a direction to face. But she had grown up in a fishing village, and she had spent her whole life learning that the ocean does not negotiate and cannot be fought, and that the only thing you could do, when something that large was moving toward you, was to understand where it was going and, if possible, get there first. Foghorn, she said. Reyes frowned. What? When it rises near the surface, 3 times in the archive data, it came up near the processing platforms. Never made contact. It came up and then went back down, like it was reacting to something. She pulled up the sonic analysis. The extraction platforms use deep-frequency resonance emitters for geological stabilization. They've been running continuously for 47 years. The frequency range. She overlaid the creature's approach vectors. Every time it surfaced near a platform, it was moving toward the emitter signal. And every time, something about the close approach, the interference pattern from multiple emitters, I think, drove it back down. Brackett was listening. His skin had gone from silver to a pale, uncertain blue. Resonance from the emitters resembles, at low frequency, the biological signature we'd expect from another creature of its class. Voss continued. It's been coming up to investigate. It hears something that sounds like it might not be alone. The room was quiet, and when it gets close enough to realize it is alone, Okubo said, it leaves. Yes, that must have been, we did that to it. 17 years of false signals. We didn't know. It came up 14 times. 14 times thinking. He stopped. I know, she said. Reyes said, can we use the emitters? The Western Shelf platforms are still operational. The creature is on an approach vector that will bring it past Platform 7 in approximately 4 hours. If we can synchronize the emitters, all 3 platforms in that cluster, into a single coherent signal at the right frequency range, it'll come up again, Reyes said. It'll come up to investigate, and if the signal is strong enough, coherent enough, it might hold its attention long enough for us to. She stopped. This was the part she wasn't sure about. To what? Reyes said, she breathed. To give it something worth following. Away from the infrastructure. Away from the extraction zone. She looked at the map. If we can get it moving eastward, toward the deep-water basin on the far side of the continental shelf, there's a valley there, 10 kilometers deep, isolated. No human or Veth infrastructure within 300 kilometers. You want to lead it away. With its own loneliness, she said. Yes. The next 3 hours were the kind of work that doesn't look like heroism from the outside, but feels, when you're in the middle of it, like every competent thing you have ever done in your life has been building toward this specific moment. Voss ran the resonance calculations herself. Okubo validated them. 2 of the Veth engineering staff. A pair of young scientists named, in translation, something like calm, water, and fast answer, modified the Platform 7 emitter array remotely from the station, rerouting power from the geological stabilization function to the acoustic projection system, pushing the frequency range into the biological register that Voss's analysis had identified. It sat beside her the whole time. He did not speak often. When he did, it was precise and useful. A correction to a frequency estimate. An observation about the creature's most recent movement pattern once. A quietly stated reminder that the Directorate was monitoring everything, and that whatever happened next would define the terms of every human Veth cooperation agreement for the next century. She was aware of that. She tried not to think about it. 1647, the creature was 4 kilometers below Platform 7 and rising. The emitter array came online at 1649. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that the word dramatic is usually meant. There was no explosion, no alarm. The creature did not breach the surface in a tower of displaced ammonia. What happened was that the deep imaging array showed, over the course of approximately 40 minutes, a very large thing changing direction, slowly, hesitantly. The way you move toward a sound you're not sure you trust. It's responding, Okubo said. Hold the signal, Voss said. She watched the track data. The creature moved east, then east-northeast, then stopped, hovered at 4 kilometers depth, and was still for 11 minutes. The longest 11 minutes of her professional life. She sat with her hands flat on the console and breathed and did not look at Reyes or Okubo or Brackett. She thought about her father, who had once talked a boat through a storm by sheer refusal to acknowledge that the storm had any opinion about where the boat should go. The creature moved east again. The next 8 hours were navigation. Pure, grinding, terrifying navigation, keeping the signal coherent, keeping it moving, keeping the creature following. The acoustic engineering required constant adjustment because the creature's biology was not a fixed receiver. It produced its own subsonic output as it moved, and that output interacted with the emitter signal in ways that Voss had to model in real time and compensate for on the fly. She did not sleep. She ate a ration bar sometime around hour 4 and did not notice what flavor it was. She drank coffee until the coffee ran out, and then drank the station's emergency caffeine supplement, which tasted like wet cardboard and industrial lubricant, and kept her hands steady. Brackett stayed with her. At some point he requested food from the station galley, and it arrived and he set it beside her without comment, and she ate it without looking up from the console. It was the kind of ordinary human-alien transaction that she thought about later, much later, as the thing she remembered most clearly from those 8 hours. Not the data, not the readings, not the moment the creature changed course, but the fact that when the largest living thing any human had ever encountered was following a signal through an alien sea, the being sitting next to her made sure she had something to eat. At 0214 hour, exactly 24 hours after the proximity alarm that had woken her, the creature settled into the deep water valley on the far side of the eastern continental shelf. The displacement readings went quiet. The seismic signature dropped. The ammonia sea, 300 kilometers below the monitoring station, went still. The debrief lasted 6 hours and was conducted by 3 separate teams: the Joint Scientific Committee, the Veth Directorate's Xenobiological Division, and a human diplomatic staff who had arrived by fast courier ship sometime during the night, and who spent much of the 6 hours trying to determine who, exactly, was responsible for what had happened and whether it constituted a violation of the Resource Treaty. Voss answered their questions with the patience of someone who has not slept in 31 hours and no longer has anything left to be afraid of. No, she said. The emitter modification had not violated the treaty's infrastructure protection clauses, because the platforms had remained operational throughout. No, she said. The creature's relocation could not be characterized as a removal of a protected species under the xenobiological annexes, because the annexes specified species with verified sapience, and the creature's sapience was as yet unverified, though she had thoughts about that. Yes, she said. She recognized that the Veth extraction operations had been the proximate cause of the creature's disturbance, insofar as 17 years of resonance emitters had been producing signals the creature interpreted as biological contact. No, she said. She did not think this made the Veth liable for the creature's subsequent behavior. Yes, she said. She thought the valley on the far side of the eastern shelf should be designated a protected exclusion zone, jointly administered with a permanent monitoring presence. And no, she said, she did not regret any of it. The Veth diplomat who had been taking notes looked up at that. His translator pendant rendered the next question carefully. You are saying that you would make the same choices again. She thought about the 11 minutes when the creature had stopped moving, and the whole world had balanced on a frequency range and a guess about loneliness. She thought about her father and the storm. She thought about a fishing village that smelled of brine and diesel, and people who understood that the ocean keeps its biggest secrets for last. I'm saying, she told him, that there was only ever one thing to do. The only question was whether we were smart enough to do it. 3 weeks later, Brackett asked to speak with her privately. They stood on the observation deck, which faced east, toward the continental shelf, where the deep water valley lay. The ammonia sea below was opaque and colorless and utterly still. I have submitted a request to the Directorate, he said. Place your name on the formal record of the Corvus 7 discovery. She looked at him. Whose name is on it now? The survey crew of the vessel that cataloged the planet in 22161. He paused. Translator pendant pulsed. They cataloged the geology, the mineral deposits, the atmospheric conditions. They missed the most important thing. We almost missed it too. But you didn't. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the ammonia clouds shifted, and for just a second, the deep imaging satellite's feed showed a ripple in the eastern sea. Faint, slow, enormous. A thing turning over in deep water. Does your Directorate know what it is? She asked. The creature. The loneliness of deep time made physical. She used the translation he had given them. Do they know what it's doing down there? They have theories, he said. What do you think? He was quiet for a long moment. His skin moved through colors she didn't have names for. Think, he said, at last, that it waited 14,000 years. I think it is patient in ways we cannot measure. I think it is listening. He paused. I think the signal your emitters were producing, the frequency range, the resonance pattern, I think it heard something in that signal that it had not heard in 14,000 years, and that is why it followed. It followed because it thought it heard its own kind. No, Brackett said. He turned and looked at her. His eyes, wide-set and deep adapted, caught the light in a way that made them look, for just a moment, very old and very full. I think it followed because the signal was not quite right. Not quite like its own kind. Different enough to be interesting. A new voice from the dark. He let that settle. It followed curiosity, not longing. She thought about that. Below them, the sea lay still and vast and full of things they hadn't learned yet. Then we have a lot of work to do, she said. Yes, he said. Believe we do. The exclusion zone designation was formalized 5 months later under the first Corvette Accord, the first joint human-Veth agreement ever negotiated under scientific rather than economic terms. The valley on the eastern shelf was designated a Class 1 protected site, restricted from all extraction activity, with a permanent monitoring buoy array that transmitted a low-level resonance signal on the biological frequency range. Not loud enough to wake the creature again, not loud enough to mislead it, just enough to say, "We know you're there." The buoys had been running for 7 months when the first response came. A shift in the deep seismic signature, a subtle modulation in the creature's subsonic output, a change so small that the automated systems flagged it as potential instrument error. Voss reviewed it herself. She reviewed it 3 times. Then she called Okubo and Brackett and Commander Reyes, and she said, "I need you all to come look at something." They came. They looked. The signature was not instrument error. The creature had changed the frequency of its output by a precise, deliberate amount. An amount that brought it into a specific alignment with the buoy signal's broadcast range. It was not mimicry. It was not random. It was the kind of change you make when you have been listening carefully for a very long time. And you have finally figured out the rhythm of what you are hearing, and you want to let the other voice know that you have understood. Nobody in the room said anything for a while. Then Brackett said very quietly, "It is patient in ways we cannot measure." Voss looked at the readout. She looked at the numbers that 17 years of data had not prepared her for. She thought about her father, and the sea, and the last secret it keeps. She thought about what it means to answer. She reached for the communications panel, and she began to type the frequency modification that would shift the buoy signal's output by a precise, deliberate amount in return. Small, careful, unmistakably intentional. Hello,